Hi everyone, my name is Erica and today I'll be presenting my final research project on the model minority myth. My research examines how the stereotype has shaped Asian American experiences and how it continues to influence racial hierarchy today. I'll be talking about the purpose of my project, the theoretical approaches I used, my research questions, and what I found. This project argues that the model minority myth isn't just a stereotype, but an active racial project that assigns meaning to Asian American identity while redistributing power in society. I analyze how this myth hides structural racism, affects Asian American psychology and social mobility, and reinforces white dominance. The research draws from required readings like Omi and Winant's Racial Formation in the United States, Clergy and Kim's article, The Racial Triangulation of Asian Americans, McIntosh's White Privilege and Male Privilege, along with several peer-reviewed academic sources. My research examines the model minority myth as a racial ideology that shapes how Asian Americans are treated and understood in U.S. society. This topic is important because even though the stereotypes seem positive, it actually erases the discrimination Asian Americans face and hides the real economic differences within the community. It also creates an emotional pressure for Asian Americans to live up to unrealistic expectations. First, the myth hides the real diversity within Asian American communities because people often assume all Asian Americans are wealthy, well-educated, or naturally good at school, when in reality, these outcomes differ widely by ethnic group, immigration pathway, and access to resources. The myth contributes to social invisibility because Asian Americans often experience discrimination or academic struggles, but these issues end up being minimized because people assume they're already doing fine. Lastly, the myth is used politically. It often becomes a tool to delegitimize discussions about racism. The idea that if Asian Americans can succeed, why can't other groups? This ignores structural factors and blames individuals rather than systems. And this is also why studying the myth sociologically is essential. My thesis is that the model minority myth operates as a racial project that maintains racial hierarchy. It portrays Asian Americans as universally successful and self-reliant, while simultaneously framing them as outsiders. This positioning hides structural racism, creates psychological burdens, and blocks multiracial solidarity. In other words, the myth looks positive on the surface, but it reinforces deeper and unfair inequalities. My research is guided by four main sociological questions. First, how does the model minority myth operate as a form of racialization? Second, how does it shape Asian American identity and educational or social experiences? Third, how does it support systems of institutional racism and white privilege? And finally, how does racial triangulation influence Asian Americans located in the overall racial order? To understand the model minority myth as a racial project, I use Omi and Winant's framework. They argue that racial projects connect cultural meanings, like stereotypes, with social structures, like policies and institutions. In the 1960s, journalists intentionally hid the success of Japanese and Chinese Americans as a way to criticize Black activists fighting for civil rights. The message was, if this group can make it, racism must not be real. This reflects conflict theory, which emphasizes how dominant groups maintain power through ideology. So from the start, the model minority myth wasn't neutral. It was designed to shift attention away from structural racism and toward individual behavior, a pattern that still occurs today. Clergy and Kim's theory of racial triangulation is also essential for explaining Asian Americans' place in the racial order. She describes two processes, relative valorization and civic ostracism. Relative valorization is when Asian Americans are praised as hardworking, disciplined, and academically strong, especially in comparison to Black Americans. Civic ostracism, at the same time, they are treated as foreigners, regardless of how many generations they have been there. This dual positioning explains why Asian Americans may appear to be part of the American dream, yet still experience things like xenophobia, exclusion, or being seen as foreigners and outsiders. Kim's framework helps reveal why the model minority myth works so effectively to maintain hierarchy, because it praises a group without granting them actual belonging. One of the biggest misconceptions reinforced by the model minority myth is that all Asian Americans are doing well economically. But the data, however, shows a much more complicated picture. Research by Wing and others find extremely high poverty rates among Southeast Asian refugee groups, such as Hmong, Laotian, and Cambodian Americans. This is an example of status inconsistency, where a group may be perceived as successful in one area while facing a lot of major disadvantages in others. Massey's discussion of stratification helps explain this as well. Inequality results not from cultural traits, but from power, wealth, and prestige that are distributed across society. Lee and Zhou's work shows that Asian American educational success is heavily shaped by selective immigration. Many Asian immigrants arrived with high levels of human capital and cultural capital. This means that comparing them to groups that arrived through forced migration or refugee pathways is sociologically inaccurate. Therefore, the myth hides major structural differences and wrongly attributes outcomes to culture. The model minority myth also affects individuals on a psychological level. Wing shows that Asian American students feel intense academic pressure because they are expected to be naturally high achieving. Using Cooley's looking glass self, we can see how young people internalize others' expectations and shape their identities around them. Mead's concept of the generalized other adds to this. Society's expectations become personal beliefs about who they should be. Lee and Zhou describe how these expectations lead to anticipatory socialization, where students prepare themselves to meet the stereotype even before they fully understand it. Musaeus and Kayang found that many Asian Americans feel they cannot seek help for stress or mental health struggles because they believe they must always appear composed. This emotional suppression shows how stereotypes operate at the micro level through symbolic interactionism. Even though the model minority myth praises Asian Americans, it does not grant them white privilege. McIntosh's framework shows that whiteness includes unearned benefits like presumed belonging, cultural centrality, and freedom from racial profiling. Asian Americans do not receive these advantages. During COVID-19, for example, Asian Americans were targeted with hate crimes, which reveals how fragile this supposed success narrative really is. Bonilla Silva's theory of colorblind racism helps explain how the myth is used politically. It suggests that racism no longer matters because one minority group appears to be thriving. This shifts attention away from the structural inequality and reinforces the idea that individuals, not institutions, are responsible for the outcomes. Therefore, the myth ends up supporting the very racial hierarchy it claims to transcend. The myth continues to reproduce itself through processes of socialization. Schools often treat Asian American students as self-sufficient, which means they may receive less support or fewer resources even when they need them. Teachers' expectations shape students' own sense of ability and belonging. Families and communities also play a role. Lee and Zhou describe how dense ethnic networks and educational norms support academic achievement. But outside observers often misinterpret these structural and community-based supports as innate cultural traits. When Asian Americans pursue non-STEM fields, struggle academically, or seek mental health resources, they may face confusion or judgment because these actions challenge the stereotype. This shows how powerful social expectations and roles are in shaping identity. In conclusion, the model minority myth is more than a stereotype. It's a racial project that reinforces inequality. It obscures economic diversity within Asian American communities, creates psychological pressures, upholds systems of white privilege, and also prevents cross-racial solidarity. Using the sociological imagination, we can see how individual experiences connect to broader structures of power. Challenging this myth is essential for creating a more accurate understanding of racial inequality and for building multiracial coalitions for justice.